Rhythm and periodicity. It wasn't only Plato who associated time with number. For Aristotle too, time was the number of motion in its before and after. He had the movement of the heavens in mind because this was conceived as ceaseless and uniform. On the other hand, for Aristotle, time was also the principle of all change. It was considered a kind of number, the number of constant motion. This remark obviously refers to the recurrence of celestial events. His view has been criticized as a mere definition of measurable time, not of time itself. But it seems to me that the connection between time and number runs much deeper. If Alexander Marshak is right, one of the oldest games of Paleolithic humans involved marking time with numbers on stones and bones. According to Marshak, this game was the beginning of civilization. From the very beginning, the markings served to count calendar dates. In ancient China, too, time and number were essentially linked, albeit in a somewhat different sense. The Chinese treated number as unimportant in its role as a measure of quantity. As Granite emphasizes, for them, number was much more a qualitative emblem or symbol that, like ours, expresses regular correspondences of essences. Number symbols reflect certain fundamental patterns of the universe in a hierarchical order. They provide information about the totality of all spatial and temporal circumstances. This is where time comes in, for these circumstantial aspects reveal themselves in a sequence of time. The numbers of these sequences vary over time, and each describes a qualitatively different moment in time. Thus, for the Chinese, time formed a continuum containing qualities or fundamental situations that could emerge relatively simultaneously in different places. The famous oracle book, the Qing, is based on this premise. In its view, time consists of ordered phases of transformation within the cosmic whole. According to the philosopher Wang Guqi, all being forms a cosmic continuum that, as such, is not perceptible to the senses. However, due to its internal dynamics, certain images or structures differentiate themselves from it, which can be read out over time and realized through numerical methods. Thus, all numbers are time indicators that characterize the quality of each moment. In China, time is therefore never an empty frame of reference, but always remained characterized by the nature of the events occurring simultaneously within it. At the same time, the universe itself has a temporal rhythmic nature whose fundamental rhythm is the alternation of yang and yin. Chinese music as a whole was created in accordance with the rhythmic structures of the universe. Connected with rhythm was the idea of enantiodromia. Whenever a line of the Qing oracle or a symbol reaches its zenith, it flips it into its opposite. A similar idea was formulated by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who called fate a world-ordering meaning, logos, that emerges from enantiodromia to create all things. Jung adopted this concept by demonstrating the psychological law that extreme mental states tend to flip into their opposites, good into evil, happiness into unhappiness, excessive intellect into instinctuality, etc. The close relationship between time and rhythm is also evident in the construction of the clock in the form of the pendulum, invented by Galileo and made usable for timekeeping by Christian Huygens. A simple pendulum motion still marks time in music today in the form of the metronome. More recently, electricity has taken over the role of generating synchronous oscillations, and alternating current sustains the vibrations with a special mechanism regulating the period of the current. Today we have gone a step further by using piezoelectric quartz or ammonia molecules to generate regular, virtually undetectable oscillations. When a quartz strip is squashed, some electrons migrate to one of its ends, This process can also be reversed. When the quartz strip is applied to an alternating voltage, the impulses of the electrons are transformed into mechanical oscillations of many thousands of vibrations per second with such regularity that the excitation frequency can be stabilized. However, quartz ages, which is why it is now being replaced by ammonia molecules, utilizing the stability of the oscillation that the N ion performs relative to the plane formed by the three H ions between its two possible poles at 24,000 MHz, that is 24 million oscillations per second. This led to the construction of so-called masers, microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. None of these clocks would be possible without the fundamental rhythmicity of energy, that is, matter. All matter, says Capra, participates in a constant cosmic dance. Every particle sings its eternal song and produces rhythmic energy structures. Modern physics has revealed that every subatomic particle not only performs an energy dance, but is also an energy dance, a pulsating process of creation and destruction. Even when we turn to the macrophysical realm and to the bodies of living beings, we encounter the same phenomenon. They all follow certain rhythms. They are so-called biological clocks. Plants and animals are thus not only bound to their spatial environment, but also to time. For example, to the solar day, a phenomenon known as the circadian rhythm, but also to the phases of the moon, to ebb and flow, or even to the solar year. Certain activities, such as foraging, are not triggered in animals by the stimulus of sunrise, but by an internal rhythm that allows the animal to plan ahead. Plants also possess something like a sense of time, because many, not all, begin to open their blossoms several hours before sunrise, as if they know that the sun is about to rise. If you artificially keep them in the dark, they still open their flowers at the same time of day. The biological clock of animals probably works through oscillations. It is like a high-level clock by which several physiological processes are regulated. Phases of activity or rest, changes in metabolism, body temperature, and other processes are regulated in this way. These rhythms appear to be innate and are probably endogenous, not generated by external stimuli. Single-celled organisms, as some plants, are bound to the rhythm as a whole. Low temperatures in plants, even differences of only 5 to 10 degrees centigrade, slow down the biological clocks. In more differentiated organisms, it is still uncertain whether the various rhythms are coordinated by a control organ or distributed across different tissues and organs. Both seem to be the case. In higher animals, a central regulator could exist in the brain. It seems, as G. Schaltenbrand states, a standardized rhythmic chronologic organization exists in the brain that functions as a whole. The fundamental rhythmic structure of our physiological life is not only its relationship to time, as Adolf Portman pointed out. Entire behavioral patterns of animals and plants exhibit a temporal nature. Every life form is before us as a shape that experiences its species-appropriate development not only in space but also in time. The social year of the Samoans and Fijians is calculated according to the cycle of the Palala worms, Unis viridis. Each year, the worm sheds a portion of its body laden with reproductive substances, and fertilization takes place in the sea, where the worm then regenerates. This rhythm depends on the phases of the moon. At the same time a specific tree, Eurythrina indica, blooms, some sea urchins of the Mediterranean off Egypt, as well as oysters and scallops in warmer seas, follow a similar rhythm in their sexual behavior. The migration of birds also follows as annual cycle. The development of the animal itself is temporal, but not merely enduring and existing in the course of time. It is a resistance against time, a mode of development provided for the protoplasm of the individual species. Just as in a rich firework display, various illuminated figures can be artfully incorporated and combined into a specific temporal form. So too do we find in the lives of many insects new organ formations provided from stage to stage, which also unfold in a precisely regulated temporal process. Humans also possess one or more biological clocks which become disrupted in long haul pilots, but they largely control them with their awareness of time. In the realm of emotions, which lie at the psychophysical boundaries, rhythm is of a particular importance. In highly excited states, we tend to make rhythmic movements, e.g., stamping, and then endlessly repeat certain thoughts and phrases. This led Jung to suspect that the unconscious complexes possess periodicity and a rhythmic component, an assumption that is now being further investigated through the observation of periodically recurring dreams motives in series. The large general complexes of humanity, Jung called them archetypes, manifest themselves in our psychophysical behaviors and were formerly experienced as gods or mythical figures. The previously mentioned astrological systems are actually human attempts to formulate a sequence and order of time, a play of archetypes by creating an ionic time rhythm. Such a play may well exist, but remains incomprehensible to us today. The relationship of certain gods to specific times and to chance, which will be discussed below, suggests a partly timeless, partly time-bound nature of the archetypes. What psychologists have researched today is the immense diversity of subjective human time experience. Young people live more future-orientated. Older people are more oriented toward the past. For aging people, time seems to pass more quickly as a result of their own slowing down. Furthermore, subjective time experience is probably determined by physiological factors, for example, temperature. These influence our sensory perception and time estimation. Poisoning by hashish, opium, mescaline, etc., also expands or compresses our time estimation. Subjective time experience is not only individually different, it also varies among social, ethnic, and psychological groups. In my opinion, adjusting to our clock is particularly difficult for intuitive people, while sensuous types remain so stuck in the here and now that they cannot imagine any future change. Because the experience of time is so closely linked to our entire life rhythm, it is usually disturbed in the case of neurosis or psychosis. Some people live faster than they can afford to, others lag behind their own potential for development. The latter then feel persecuted or hunted by time. If my above explanation is correct, since time is linked to the inner rhythm of the soul's core, or self, the conscious-unconscious psychic whole, it becomes understandable that any neurotic deviation from the rhythm of the self also leads to a disturbed relationship with time. Besides biological rhythms, memory also plays a role in our experience of time, but its complex nature has not yet been fully understood. Many researchers assume that since the brain retains all information registered in our conscious processes, including unconscious perceptions, most of it can no longer be consciously recalled. Much of it can only be remembered summarily and generally. This means that most memories are organized into schemas. Susan Lange calls this a symbolic transformation of experience. From a Jungian point of view, this organization is brought about by the archetypes, since the latter are the innate psychophysical organizers of human experience. Whatever role memory plays in this, our mind, as Ritva emphasizes, is temporal in nature. It generates the flow of thought of our consciousness. Thus we return to the original idea of time as a quantitative and qualitative stream of coincident inner and outer events. J. W. Dunn, in his book Experiment with Time, attempted to describe time as multidimensional, with the different dimensions of time corresponding to different mental states. The model seems fundamentally accurate to me insofar as time is viewed as a multidimensional phenomenon characterized by the simultaneity of different mental states. Right. Some thoughts on the rhythm of thinking and Hegelian speculative thinking. The object or content of philosophy is not a finite, sensible item of interest known by its predicates. It's that which Hegel terms the concept. Content is the concept when it is self-determining content, and consequently the concept does not present an object or content in a fixed or final state, but as its own becoming or development. This links to what she was saying about time and the flow of consciousness. Consciousness and the subconscious being essentially temporal. In the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel continually refers to but never defines the concept. Rather, he associates it with a certain way of thinking or working. It involves labour, the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, the essence of the object, self-moving, self-like, and it has an immanent rhythm. That's the important point we're making here. And it has an inner life. And we will get into this later, in a moment. From this we can glean that the concept refers not to some lifeless abstraction, like the concept of the number 4, but to the cause of activity and movement in something. The concept to all intelligible things, what the soul is to a living thing, the source and cause and purpose, the reason why something, issue, object, plant or animal develops one way or another. It names a certain way of approaching the being of beings, and so all in all the concept is difficult to define. Recall what was said earlier about heliotropic plants that know when dawn is coming. Since the concept is the object's own self, which presents itself as the coming to be of the object, it is not a passive subject inertly supporting the accidents. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving concept which takes its determination back into itself. In this movement, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences and the content, and constitutes the determinateness, that is, the differentiated content and its movement, instead of remaining inertly over against it. A human being is the activity responsible for each quality, and hence the qualities are informative only if read as indications of or moments of an ongoing activity of being a self. And this activity of being a self both causes and collapses finite qualities. That is the concept. The simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into shapes, and at the same time the dissolution of these existent differences, and the dissolution of the splitting up is just as much a splitting up and a forming of members, with this the two sides of the whole movement which before were distinguished, that is to say, the passive separateness of the shapes in the general medium of independence, and the process of life collapse into one another. And now this is a crucial point. The essence of life is infinity. There is no final point to it. Its essence is the supersession of all differences, and what that means is that life is subjected to the condition of being rolled into something greater, a greater unity of things totally disconnected, and all of these differentiated moments, these existing members, are every one an enduring existence, and they really are differences because they are in a particular medium. Now, philosophy demands patience as it endeavours to relate an albeit protracted and meandering tale concerning thinking's self-development. What is required is a manner of presentation rather than a method, one that matches the concept, a performance that presents things not as fixed and unvarying, but rather as their own becoming and their own developmental movement, a kind of presentation that dramatizes the subject, that brings itself to a falling down rather than to a stable subject with fixed predicates. The concept demands patience as a lengthy tale demands patience, and prior to the reader embarking upon a lengthy excursion into system, science, or philosophy, an anticipation of our endpoint would merely impede our travels. The premature certainty of decisive predicative sentences regarding grandiose subjects renders us incapable of flexing and adapting with the changing nature of the subject as it unfolds. Therefore, what is to be offered at the beginning is not certainty, but perplexity. And a fitting kind of puzzling statement made at the outset can ignite interest and entice both researcher and reader to embark together upon the lengthy voyage of inquiry and interrogation. In finite thought, the two uses of the word to be are sustained separately in the sense that Hegel is logically different from a kind of judgment that Hegel is a German philosopher. It is evident that Hegel's approach does rely upon a progressive determination of an indeterminate concept, being pure being without further determination. But he argues against the idea that the inadequacy of the finite categories to express the truth entails the impossibility of objective cognition. For Hegel, classical judgments rely on passive subject, which constitutes the basis to which content is attached and upon which the movement runs back and forth. A speculative proposition, on the other hand, aspires to combine the identity and predicate logic uses of to be in the same proposition. In the speculative proposition, the subject is related to another subject, as in the proposition, to use Hegel's example, the actual is the universal. When one says the actual is the universal, the actual as subject disappears in its predicate. The universal is not meant to have merely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the essence of the actual. Thinking, therefore, loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject, when in the predicate it is thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate it does not return into itself, but into the subject of the content. Albeit both terms are subjects and hence relate to themselves through the proposition, this is not a simple tautology, as the two terms are also not identical with one another. The speculative proposition cannot be understood either to be asserting the identity of the two terms, or predicating one of the terms to the other, and in virtue of this fact, thought fails to make sense of the proposition. It is not an easy matter to identify speculative thinking. Were we to observe at once what it was, there would hardly be any need for a system of science. Speculative thinking is experienced by ordinary consciousness as being thrust backward, Gegenstoß, recoil. Hence, rather than providing us with a positive definition, Hegel acquaints us with such an elevated mode of thinking through means of negation. Were we to feel that we could precisely pin down speculative thinking, then it would become a fixed category of argumentation, and it is this latter that stalls movement and insists upon commitment, in the manner by which one engaged in heuristic argumentation, marked by sophistry, insists upon pinning down an adversary's position for the purpose of raising objections. It is the appreciation of the dynamic movement of wholes that is speculative thinking's glorious achievement, albeit this appears to us primarily and at the outset as a penchant for dismantling and levelling out all our fixed thoughts. Speculative thinking seemingly set upon sowing the seeds of confusion, crying havoc with regard to our familiar categorical taxonomy, and yet this is very far removed from any skepticism. The philosopher's choice of purposely demanding language may perplex us not into a state of either ataraxia or aporia, but rather into further interrogation, for it is the speculative thinker, and not the skeptical one, that discovers a new kind of intelligibility in determinate negations. A determinate negation that is a negation that has content. It is the positive aspect of the dialectic which makes the conceptual movement a constructive one and not a purely destructive one. The speculative proposition represents the tonal key, and here we're getting back to rhythm, of the infinite and dialectical performance as the reiteration of the second subject. In the example given, this is the universal, as both different and identical to the first subject. The actual compels thought to consider the subject itself no longer as a fixed identity, but as something which is itself changed by the rhythm or the movement of the proposition. This is to be distinguished from the natural rhythm of a language, whereby much is lost in translation. If Mozart had meant his operas to have been sung in English, he would have written different notes. And furthermore, and we're bringing Nietzsche here, this is relevant, for torture, German books are for everyone with a third ear, How reluctantly he stands by the slowly revolving quagmire of toneless voices and rhythms without dance that the Germans call a book. And the Germans who read books, how lazily, how grudgingly, how badly they read. How many Germans know and require themselves to know that there is in art in every good sentence. Art that wants to be discerned to the extent that the sentence wants to be understood. A misunderstanding about its tempo, for instance, and the sentence itself is misunderstood. As the second subject is not simply a further determination, but rather the subject itself, the whole proposition is put into motion, and to express this, formally the general nature of the judgment or proposition, which involves a distinction between subject and predicate, is shattered by the speculative proposition and the proposition of identity, which the former contains the counterthrust against the subject-predicate relationship. As Hegel puts it, good and evil, as this is an example, were the specific differences yielded by the thought of spirit as immediately existent, since their antithesis has not yet been resolved, and they are conceived of as the essence of thought, each of them having an independent existence of its own. Man is a self lacking any essential being, and is synthetic ground of their existence and their conflict. But these universal powers just as much belong to the self, or the self is their actuality. On the matter of the infinite, the determination of life as it has issued from the notion, or the general result with which we enter this sphere, is sufficient to characterize it without having further to develop its nature. Its sphere is completely determined in the following moments. Essence is an infinity as the supersession of all distinctions. The pure movement of axial rotation, itself repose, being an absolutely restless infinity, independence itself, in which the difference of the movement are resolved, the simple essence of time, which in this equality with itself has a stable shape of space. So living things have an interiority with self-consciousness, then we have therefore entered the native realm of truth. With its dynamic reflection into itself, self-consciousness is hunger for life, and curiosity is a desire for a habitat somewhere to be at home. Life differentiates itself into the infinity of differences and self-consciousnesses and grasps the unity of the differences. Hence, it is no easy matter to take all of life in the profusion that comes with it, the world of living things. The nature of life is in need of further development. Self-consciousness is moved by something in immediate desire. Its essence is infinity. There is no final point to it, and essence is the supersession of all differences, the condition of being rolled into something greater, a greater union of things totally disconnected, all these differentiated moments, existing members enduring in existence, and they really are differences since they are in a particular medium. The metaphor Hegel gives for this pure movement is that of axial rotation, as we mentioned earlier. A precise emblem for something changing in a process while remaining still. I am changing in my position. Everything is changing while my orientation is in the same place, and this is a restless infinity, an independent relation of is what it is, and it's changing. The succession of states. It is time we are dealing with here, spatialized time. Life has its access, its concept. To be life is to be at one state at one time, at another state at another. Differences are taking place, and so at which point do I become simply different? There is this intensive unity from moment to moment to moment. And what does each moment have in relation to infinite life? The differences, however, are just as much present as differences in the simple universal medium, for this universal flux has its negative nature only in being the supersession of them, but it cannot supersede the different moments if they do not have an enduring existence. It is this very flux, as a self, identical independence, which is itself an enduring existence, in which therefore they are present as distinct members and parts existing on their own account. Being no longer has the significance of abstract being, nor has their pure essentiality the significance of abstract universality. On the contrary, their being is precisely that simple unit fluid substance or of pure movement within itself. The difference, however, qua difference, of these members with respect to one another consists in general in no other determinateness than that of the moments of infinity or of the pure movement itself. There are differences by being in this particular medium, part of a movement, a universal fluidity or flux, and each one not only has its meaning or is part of the whole, each one is an existing member. For it were it not, there could be no supersession. Everyone is in need of an ontological dignity, its greatest structure. As for which is primary, the parts or the unity, the answer is both. For were that not the case, there would be no life. A living thing has to be what it is at every one of its living moments. In order to be alive, were the cycle to end, we would have a corpse. The living thing is a constant process of transcending itself at any given time. It is wholly living at every temporal moment. The living being is what its universality looks like for the living thing, for life, just life, is not enough. Life is hunger. The simple I is this genus of the simple universal, for which the differences are not differences only by being the negative essence of the shaped independent moments. And self-consciousness is thus certain of itself only by superseding this other that presents itself to self-consciousness as an independent life. Self-consciousness is desire, certain of the nothingness of this other. It explicitly affirms that this nothing is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object and thereby gives itself the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-conscious itself in an objective manner. That's from Hegel there. This special kind of anticipation that is provoked by bewilderment is captured by this special kind of speculative sentence that is demonstrative of speculative thinking, a more desirable of thinking, at the very least, when we wish to be philosophical, than the simply argumentative or the imaginative, those alternative modes of thinking that apparently apprehend the true as the subject, but they apprehend the subject differently. Anyway, there's a note there about Begriffen, which we needn't go into. To bring it all together, as Louise von Franz pointed out, she was talking about differentiated organisms with various rhythms coordinated by the control organ or distributed across different tissues and organs. In higher animals, the central regulator could exist in the brain. A standardized rhythmic chronological organization exists in the brain that functions as a whole. As Hegel put it, it is in this nature of what it is to be in its being, its own notion, that logical necessity in general consists. This alone is the rational element and the rhythm of the organic whole. It is as much knowledge of the content as the content is the notion and essence. In other words, it alone is speculative philosophy.